Welcome to GeoHistory Files. Here, history isn't just remembered, it's investigated. Every empire, every war, and every political decision leaves a legacy that still shapes our world today. If you're new here, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Now, let's uncover the story they never wanted you to know. There is a piece of land in the Black Sea that has changed hands more often than almost any other place on Earth. It is small, barely larger than a modest country, jutting out from the northern coast like a fist thrust into warm water. And yet, for nearly 3,000 years, empires have bled for it, built upon it, and been buried beneath it. Crimea has never truly belonged to anyone. It has only ever been held temporarily by whoever was strong enough to keep it, and unlucky enough to want it. This is the story of that holding, and that letting go, repeated across the centuries until the pattern itself becomes the point. The land begins in silence. Long before names were written down, the steppe rolled north from the peninsula in an unbroken ocean of grass. It was a corridor without walls. Anyone could cross it. Everyone did. Horsemen came out of the east in waves, generation after generation, and the peninsula sat at the end of that corridor like a stone dropped into a doorway. Whoever controlled the grass controlled the movement of peoples, and whoever controlled Crimea controlled the sea. The first to understand this were not the nomads, but the sailors. Greek traders came in their ships around the 8th century before the Common Era, and they saw what the horsemen could not, that the peninsula was a hinge. Grain flowed south from the steppe. Wine and oil and silver flowed north from the Mediterranean. Between them stood Crimea, and a place that stands between two worlds grows rich by simply existing. They built cities of white stone along the coast. They planted vineyards. They minted coins. For centuries, the colonies prospered, feeding the great cities of Greece with steppe wheat, growing fat on the trade of others. But this would not last. The nomads they traded with were only the first of many. Behind the Scythians came the Sarmatians. Behind them, the Goths. Behind them, the Huns. Each wave pressed on the one before, and the peninsula absorbed them all, not as a fortress absorbs an army, but as sand absorbs water. The cities changed masters. The vineyards changed hands. The white stone was reused for new walls under new kings who spoke new languages. No one destroyed Crimea. It was simply inherited again and again by strangers. Into this rhythm came Rome. Rome did not conquer the peninsula so much as lean on it. From the great capital far to the west, and later from the new capital at Constantinople, imperial power reached across the Black Sea like a long arm holding a distant object. The old Greek cities became clients. Garrisons appeared. The peninsula was folded into the largest and most durable political structure the ancient world had ever produced. For a time it seemed permanent. Rome was eternal. Everyone said so. The empire in the west collapsed, and the peninsula barely noticed, because the eastern half endured. Constantinople held the coast for centuries. The Byzantines built churches into the cliffs, carved monasteries out of the rock, and turned Crimea into a Christian frontier facing the endless pagan grass. Missionaries went out from its harbors. In the 9th century, it was near these shores that two brothers, Cyril and Methodius, worked among the Slavic peoples, and from their work would eventually come an alphabet that hundreds of millions would one day use. The peninsula, once a place that only received, had begun to send things outward. Faith, letters, ideas. Yet the arm that held it was growing tired. Byzantium was rich, but it was surrounded, and Crimea was the edge of its reach, the place easiest to lose. And on the steppe behind it, a new and greater force was gathering, one that would not lean on the peninsula but crush it entirely. The Mongols came in the 13th century. They came as no one had come before, not in waves, but in a single, coordinated tide, an empire on horseback that swallowed the grass corridor whole. The steppe that had always fed invaders into Crimea now delivered its greatest one. The peninsula fell into the domain of the Golden Horde, the western wing of the largest land empire in human history. And then something happened that Crimea had seen many times and would see again. The conquerors settled. They stopped being strangers. The Mongol and Turkic peoples who ruled the steppe mixed with those already there, adopted Islam, and over generations became something new. the Crimean Tatars. By the 15th century, as the Great Horde fractured, the Tatars formed their own state, the Crimean Khanate, with its capital at Bakhchisarai, the Palace of Gardens. For the first time in a very long time, the peninsula was ruled from within itself rather than from some distant throne. It reached a kind of peak. The Khanate was powerful, sophisticated, feared. Its cavalry ranged deep into the lands to the north, raiding the emerging Slavic principalities for captives. For over 2 centuries, the slave markets of the peninsula sold hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps more than 1 million across the whole era, carried off from the fields of what would later be called Ukraine and Russia. This was the dark engine of its wealth, and few at the time called it dark. It was simply how power fed itself on the steppe. But the Khanate held its throne only by kneeling to another. To survive between giants, it had bound itself to the Ottoman Empire, the vast Turkish state that now ruled the southern shore of the Black Sea. The Khan reigned, but the Sultan protected. The peninsula was independent in name and dependent in fact, which is a fragile way to exist, because it lasts only as long as the protector is strong. However, the protector was not eternal either. To the north, the raided principalities were no longer weak. They were merging, they were arming, they were becoming an empire of their own. That empire was Russia. For centuries, the Slavic lands had been the prey of the peninsula. Now the relationship reversed, slowly at first, then all at once. Under Catherine the Great in the 18th century, Russia pushed south toward the warm sea it had always lacked, and Crimea stood directly in its path, the same hinge, the same doorway, coveted now by a new claimant. The Ottomans were pushed back. The Khanate, cut off from its protector, was declared independent, then quietly absorbed. In 1783, without a great battle, Catherine annexed the peninsula outright. The Palace of Gardens fell silent. The independent Tatar state that had ruled for 300 years simply ceased to exist. Russia did what every power before it had done. It renamed the cities in its own tongue. It built a fortress and a fleet. On the southwestern coast rose Sevastopol, a naval base carved from the rock, and from that harbor the Black Sea Fleet would sail for the next 2 centuries under one flag after another. The peninsula had a new master, and for a while the new master seemed unbreakable. Yet the very thing that made Crimea valuable made it dangerous. A place everyone wants is a place everyone will fight over. The fighting came in 1853, when Russia pressed too hard against the fading Ottomans. The great powers of Europe reacted. Britain and France, unwilling to let Russia dominate the Black Sea, sent armies and fleets against the peninsula. The war that followed took its name from the land itself, the Crimean War. It was one of the first modern wars, and one of the ugliest. Armies dug into the earth around Sevastopol and stayed there for nearly a year. Disease killed more men than bullets. Tens of thousands died in the mud and the cold, in a place most of them could not have found on a map. It was here that a nurse named Florence Nightingale walked the wards at night, and here that the world first read war, reported by telegraph, near live in the newspapers of distant capitals. Sevastopol fell. Russia lost. And yet Russia kept the peninsula because the victors did not want it either. They only wanted Russia weakened. The land itself remained what it had always been, a possession too costly to hold and too important to surrender. The pattern held. It would hold through everything that came next. The 20th century arrived, and with it, collapse on a scale the peninsula had never known. The Russian Empire fell in revolution. Crimea became a battleground in the civil war that followed, changing hands between reds and whites like a coin flipped in the dark. When the fighting ended, it belonged to a new kind of empire, the Soviet Union that ruled in the name of the very people the old world had oppressed. But the new masters were as heavy as the old. Famine struck the land in the 1920s and again in the 1930s. Part of the vast starvation that swept the region under Soviet policy. Then came a war greater than any before it. In 1941, the German army seized the peninsula, and Sevastopol endured a second terrible siege, its defenders holding for 250 days before the city fell into ruin. When the Soviets took it back, they took vengeance on those they blamed. In May of 1944, over the course of just 3 days, nearly the entire Crimean Tatar population, around 200,000 people, the descendants of the Khanate itself, was loaded onto trains and deported to Central Asia on Stalin's order. Thousands died on the journey and in the years after. A people who had lived on the peninsula for 7 centuries were removed from it almost completely. The land that had absorbed so many now expelled one of its own. And then in 1954 came a decision that would echo far longer than anyone imagined. The Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev transferred Crimea from Russia to Ukraine, both republics within the same union. At the time, it meant almost nothing. It was a line drawn on an internal map, a bureaucratic gesture, a gift between 2 rooms in the same house. However, houses do not always remain standing. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, quietly and completely, the way empires sometimes do after appearing eternal. When the borders froze into place, the internal lines became international ones. Ukraine was independent, and Crimea, by that line from 1954, was inside it. But most of the people on the peninsula spoke Russian, felt Russian, remembered a Russian past. And in the great harbor of Sevastopol, the Black Sea Fleet still rode at anchor, now claimed by 2 nations at once. The doorway had a new dispute over who held the key. For over 20 years, the arrangement held in an uneasy peace. The fleet leasing its own former home, the peninsula belonging to one country while leaning toward another. Then in early 2014, it broke. As Ukraine turned toward the west, soldiers without insignia appeared on the roads of Crimea. They took the airports, the parliament, the checkpoints, swiftly and almost without a shot. A vote was held under their watch and declared overwhelming. Within weeks, Russia announced that Crimea had returned to it after 60 years. Most of the world refused to recognize it. Sanctions followed. The peninsula became, once again, a place the world argued over a hinge in a far larger confrontation that would erupt into open war across Ukraine in the years that followed. And so the observer of time arrives at the present and finds the pattern unbroken. The Greeks held Crimea and lost it. Rome held it and passed. Byzantium held it until its arm grew tired. The Mongols held it until they became something else. The Tatars held it for 3 centuries and then vanished from it in 3 days. Russia took it, lost a war over it, kept it, gave it away, and took it back. Each master believed the holding was permanent. Each was, in the end, only a tenant. The peninsula does not remember their names. The grass corridor still runs north. The warm sea still laps the white stone. Some of it Greek, some Genoese, some Soviet, all of it reused. The harbor at Sevastopol still shelters a fleet, as it has under every flag for 200 years. There is a lesson buried in that repetition, and it is very old. Power over a place is never ownership. It is only occupation measured against the patience of time. The strong come and build and rename and believe. And time, which owns nothing and wants nothing, simply waits for the next tenant to arrive. Crimea has never belonged to anyone. It has only ever been borrowed.